Alright, I wanted to do another reaction video, and I posted a video justifying why I make videos in criticism of both atheism and monotheism, and some of the responses were negative. Most were at least somewhat interesting, but I kept getting a lot of the same responses, and whenever that happens, I view it as a sign that I should probably make another video explaining that. So this Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson debate is quite long. This was before Sam kind of lost his mind about politics and started advocating openly for censorship and murder. But that's what you would expect for somebody who has his intellectual roots in the French Revolution. We actually see a little bit of that in this video. But I can't react to the whole thing clearly, so I'm going to do two 15-minute parts that I think are relevant because they highlight the differences, or they highlight the difference between Sam and Jordan's thinking, and how Sam lumps polytheism and monotheism into the dangerous belief system category, but he can't understand that atheism has the same, or it can have similar negative qualities. So anyway, I'm gonna let these guys do the talking, and we'll see what goes down.
I thought I could start by first acknowledging how fun this has been to have these series of dialogues with Jordan. Now this is the fourth event we've done, and the second with Douglas. And we clearly share a common project. I mean, we are trying to figure out how to live the best lives possible, both individually and collectively, and we're trying to figure out how to build societies that safeguard that opportunity for as many people as possible. And I think we each have a sense that ideas are really the prime movers here. That it's not that the world is filled with bad people doing bad things, because that's what bad people do, though there's some of that. It is mostly that so much of humanity is living under the sway of bad ideas, and it's bad ideas that can cause good people, or at least totally normal people like ourselves, to do bad things, all the while trying to live the best possible lives. And that really is the tragedy of our circumstance, that we can be that confused. So this is where the difference between Jordan and me in particular opens up, which is, how do you view religion in this contest between good ideas and bad ideas? And for me, religion emphatically gets placed on the side of bad and old and worth retiring ideas, or ideas worth retiring. And I guess by analogy, I would ask you to consider astrology. But maybe I can just get a sense of who I'm talking to. What percentage of you, I want to know, believe in astrology, which is to say, who among you, and you can signal this by applause or howls of enthusiasm, what percentage of you, let me just spell it out so you know what you're committing to, and you know how crazy your neighbor is, in fact.
Imagine if somebody was taking a census and they were like, well, let me see who's the crazy person and who's the sane person. So that's already a very dishonest formulation of what he's trying to do there. So not very helpful, but I guess maybe it serves his shallow and narrow point while further alienating people who might otherwise be interested in listening to him.
What percentage of you believe that human personalities and human events and the difference between good and bad luck in a human life is the result of what the planets are doing against the background of stars? Let's hear it. Somebody out there. Okay, so now you should know that something like 25% of your neighbors believe that. Oh, there you go. So I'm here. Wait. I'm hearing a heckler among the astrologers. Is that?
Heckling isn't cool, no matter what your belief system is.
Is that possible? This is the first astrological heckler I've heard. You must be an Aries, sir. So it won't surprise you. I have a related question, which is
I wish that heckler would shut the fuck up.
what what percentage of you, I want to know, are religious? Which is to say, who among you believe in God, a personal God, a God that can hear prayers, a God that can take an interest in the lives of human beings and occasionally enforce good outcomes versus bad outcomes? Who among you, and now again, I want to hear applause or silence, believe in that sort of God? Okay, so this is my concern. This is my concern with what Jordan has been saying and writing, lo, these many months. I feel that you're in danger of misleading this second group of people. That the way you talk about God has convinced and will continue to convince some percentage of humanity that it's fine to hold on to this old sort of God, this God that can hear prayers and that can intervene or not in the lives of human beings. And as we've begun to explore that, I think there are a lot of problems with that kind of belief. If nothing else, there are many such gods on offer, and devotion to them becomes irreconcilable among true believers. And my concern is that you could do exactly what you do with religion with astrology, right? It would be no more legitimate to obfuscate the boundary between clear thinking and superstition there.
So he's going to get into more of his explanation, but I want to point out that this is a very slimy trick that he just did rhetorically. So he couches a fringe belief system that is still a fairly legitimate belief system, even though it's fringe. So he's basically appealing to popularity here. And he's saying, well, okay, so you don't believe in this, but you do believe in this other belief system, and hidden inside of that is the idea that both of them are insane. And the problem with that is he cannot define sanity, and he also has no real justification for saying, or at least I haven't heard a justification for saying why belief in either of these things are bad. So, but basically what he's doing is he's using popularity to try to do more work than it needs to try to make the point for him. And popularity has no bearing on truth whatsoever. So the other point that I'd like to make here is that he's using an argument or a rhetorical technique that I've heard called stochastic terrorism. So he's saying that, because Jordan talks about the psychological significance of religion, which, by the way, is the significance of religion, front and center, is the meaning people get from it. So he's saying, because you talk about this, therefore, you could convince people that what you're saying, or you could convince somebody of something that I believe to not be true. And it's like, okay, well, firstly, why is it bad that they believe that? I guess maybe he'll get to that later. But secondly, you can't blame Jordan for people misinterpreting his positions. Like, that's nonsensical. If I say, I don't know. Basically, you can't blame somebody for people misinterpreting and doing bad things on behalf of something they misinterpreted. Like, you can't blame your speech for other people. You can't. Let me put it this way. There's not a causal link between somebody else's misunderstanding and your speech. Now, if you actively say, go out and kill people for Muhammad, I agree that makes sense in the context of Islam, and I'm not. And I think that that form of Islam should be dismantled and destroyed, because it places too much emphasis on like war and divine retribution and othering. But the idea that, like, if somebody says praise Allah or something in a very like reform way that doesn't make people, it's not directly a call to violence, and then somebody goes out and says, well, to praise Allah I need to kill people, and then does a suicide bombing, that's not my fault. That's their fault for misinterpreting, and really for being a Muslim in general. But anyway, so I guess we'll hear more of his explanation now.
Because the this traditional God and the doctrines that support him are on no firmer ground than astrology is now today. And astrology, you could almost everything you say about religion, it's the fact that it has organized human thinking for thousands of years, that it's a cultural universal, that every group of people has given rise to some form of it, that it has archetypal significance, that has powerful stories. All of that can be said about astrology.
Man, Sam's really out here making an argument for polytheism. Good for him.
And in fact, some additional things can be said about astrology that would argue in its favor. For instance, astrology is profoundly egalitarian. You know, there's no bad zodiac sign. Whoever you are, everyone's got a great zodiac sign, and you know, it's just an inconvenient fact of the discipline that if I read you Charles Manson's horoscope, you know, 95% of the audience would find it relevant.
Okay, so misreading horoscopes is a very common thing. You can make Barnum statements that are designed to be relevant to everybody, and they will be, shocker, relevant to everybody. If you design something like most horoscopes are, like a newspaper horoscope is, to be relevant to everybody, it's going to be relevant to everybody. But that is a definition of bad astrology. And just like there's popular science that lies to science consumers, there's popular biology that lies or gives a very dumbed down or childlike representation to New Age people. And most New Age people are gullible as shit. Most people who consume science are gullible as shit. Most Christians are gullible as shit. You can point to a sort of stupid preacher preaching to the choir and they're just eating it all up. You can point to that and be like, see, Christianity doesn't work. But that would be dishonest. You can point to Bill Nye the Science Guy and be like, well, what he's saying has been disproven because he's talking about Newton and now we know Einstein's right and all this stuff. But that doesn't mean that he's like, the dumbed down version of a thing is less legitimate from a standpoint of seeking truth, but it's just as legitimate for trying to convey values and messages to people in a way that is palatable.
And that's how easily falsifiable astrology is. But that
reading Barnum statements does not somebody being a con man does not falsify astrology. That's just a straw man, and I expect better from him, actually. Actually, no, I don't, because it's Sam Harris, but I wish I could expect better from him.
My concern is that we could live in a world where societies are shattered over things like, you know, different zodiac interpretations. And we don't live in that world for good reason, because we have beaten astrology into submission.
Or rather, astrology has become less popular. And keep in mind, something being less popular does not mean that it's more or less true. Because, imagine what he's saying is coming from the mouth of a Catholic church, and they're talking about beating heretics into submission. Right? Think about that. Does that mean that Catholicism is true from the atheistic perspective, from, whatever Sky Daddy interpretation they're making of it? No. It just means that it's not popular. It's not fashionable. It's not cool. You don't get to be smart, cool Sam Harris talking about secularism. But I guarantee you, if astrology were the popular belief system, Sam Harris would be up on stage talking about it, because he embraces the current thing. So secularism is currently the current thing, and that's falling out of favor, which is what this conversation is about. But in a world where he describes where astrology was the current thing, he'd be talking about that, because it has nothing to do with rationality and everything to do with popularity and the appearance of intellectual performance.
I would say that religion, in terms of revealed religion and belief in a personal God, is, over the centuries, getting the same treatment by science and rationality, and should be. And it is a perverse circumstance that we live in a world that is shattered by religion.
So Sam Harris is advocating for one belief system among many. Let me put it like this. I've said this before on this channel. If there are 12 clowns and they're running around in a circus pretending to read, And you, being the intelligent, rational audience member, decide that you're tired of listening to the clowns doing their performance, and you jump down with a copy of Shakespeare, get up on the podium, and start loudly reciting Shakespeare in the center of the ring. The audience looks down and they see a 13th clown. There's no, like, if you're gonna try to, like, position yourself outside of all beliefs while having contempt for everything, you're gonna have to try harder or present something that actually has value. Because right now, he's not presenting anything of value. He's just being a critical clown.
So I think what I'll do first is adopt the exceptionally difficult and likely counterproductive position of saying something not so much in defense of religion, but in defense of astrology.
Ah, fucking men. That's the right rhetorical move. Because since Sam Harris has sneakily conflated religion with astrology and then conflated them both with insanity, the correct move is to justify astrology, then justify religion, and then prove that they're not insane. That's the correct rhetorical move. Now, a more standard theologian would have said, well, I don't believe in astrology, but let me tell you why my God is the true God. And then Sam Harris could just point back to astrology, and you never would have stopped the rhetorical cycle. This is the intelligent move.
Knowing full well that that's fundamentally a fool's errand. But there's something I want to point out, is that, first of all, astrology was astronomy in its nascent form. And astrology was also science in its nascent form, just like alchemy was chemistry in its nascent form. And so sometimes you have to dream a crazy dream with all of the error that that crazy dream entails, because you have an intuition that there's something there to motivate you to develop the intuition to the point where it actually becomes of genuine practical utility.
I think in science they call that a hypothesis.
Now, when we look back on the astrologers and we view their contributions to the history of the world with contempt, we should also remember that the people who built Stonehenge, for example, and the first people who determined that our fates were in part written in the stars, were people whose astrological beliefs were indistinguishable from their astronomical beliefs.
Ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, the ancient Celtic burial sites, ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztecs. Yeah, every single good thing that came from the classical world was a function of astrology. So you tell me, what's the real opiate of the masses?
And you might think, well, in what sense is your fate written in the stars? And I would say it's certainly the case insofar as there are such things as cosmic regularities. So it was the dream of astrology that there was some relationship between the movement of the planetary bodies and the fixed stars and human destiny, and that's what drove us to build the first astronomical observatories, and to also determine that there was a proper time for planting and a proper time for harvesting, and a way of orienting yourself in the world, for example, by using the North Star. It's also the poetic ground that enabled us to identify the notion that you could look up and orient yourself towards the heavens, and that there was a metaphorical relationship between that and positioning yourself properly in life.
This is saying, the fundamental axiom of astrology is called the Hermetic law of rhythm. And rhythm basically just means time. Okay, so in Hermeticism, I can't speak for any other polytheistic traditions because I'm not a part of them, but in Hermeticism, everything is made out of vibrations. We now know that that's true. And those vibrations exist at high levels, like planets, and low levels, like inside of an atom. Okay, that's all true as well. This is all backed up. These people figured this out thousands of years ago. And now we all know it's true. all astrology is the law of rhythm. It's saying that in those vibrations there are rhythms, and those rhythms correspond to not only human actions but broader social actions that they would refer to as gods. Not just social, also biological, but biological in a shared way. It's not subjective in that it's idiosyncratic and random. It's regularities in subjectivity that make it an objective pattern that's best represented as a personality, not as an equation. So why is it a god and not a feeling? Well, because in classic neuroscience, a feeling is like an equation. Like you put sugar in, you get happy out. And except the only problem with that is we're alive, and the things that make us up are alive, and they're shared between everybody. So you could actually abstract out kind of like a neural network.
And at a deeper level, the cosmos was the place that the human imaginative drama was externalized and draped itself out into the world as something that was essentially observable, so that we could derive great orienting fictions from the observation of our imagination.
As above, so below.
And so part of the problem that Sam is pointing to is the difficulty of distinguishing valid poetic impulse from invalid poetic impulse, and that really is a tremendous problem. You see that arise also in people who have religious delusions attendant upon manic depressive disorder or schizophrenia. But so much of what eventually manifests itself as hardcore pragmatic scientific belief has its origin in wild flights of poetic fantasy. And it's also the case, by the way, that that's actually how your brain is organized, as far as I can tell, that when you, and it isn't just me, I actually, there's a very large, what would you call it, research literature outlining the relative functions of the right and left hemisphere, and it certainly appears to be the case that when we encounter something absolutely unknowable or unknown, what we do is drape that unknown thing in fantasy as a first pass approximation to the truth, and then refine that fantasy as a consequence of iterative critical analysis. And so Sam believes that what should happen is that the poetic and fictional domain should be supplanted by the rational domain.
Before he gives his rebuttal, I want to say that what he's saying about the mind perceiving fantasy first is true, except that he's contrasting fantasy with hardcore reality. I don't even think he realizes he's doing it. The thing is, we don't have access to that hardcore reality, not really. What we have access to are fictions, and those fictions can exist at small levels and big levels, but they're still fictions. Now, that doesn't mean there's no causal or effective correspondence between our actions and those fictions. I mean, obviously, they function, but that doesn't mean that they are real or the thing in itself, as Kant would say. But anyway, let's hear Sam Harris's rebuttal, and then we'll skip to the final part that I want to look at.
Just close the loop there. Not
Okay.
quite. I think we need poetry and fiction, and then there's more to engaging with reality than being a scientist in a white lab coat. But we need to be able to clearly distinguish fact from fantasy, or fact from merely fertile flights of the imagination. And we want to be rigorous there and rational there. And it's not that there's no place for mere creativity that's not
Well, I guess, well,
on
then
the rails of rationality.
Well, look, fair enough then, but I mean, then partly what we are disputing is the relative import and of those two domains. Let's say the poetic and the fictional, and the rational,
and the status of religion now in that.
Well, I have a hard time reconciling that to some degree with your more what would you say, formal statements about the problem, because your mechanism, the mechanism that you put forth above all, outside of truth, is rationality. And it isn't clear to me if you're willing to allow the utility of spiritual experience, which you do, and if you're willing to make, what would you say, allowances for the necessity of the poetic imagination, exactly how it is that is also encapsulated under the rubric of pure rationality. See, let's see, and here's something, you can tell me what you think about this. And I've been thinking a lot about what Sam and I have been talking about, by the way. You know, so I'm making the case in my writing that democratic institutions not only grew out of the Judeo-Christian substrate, but that they're properly ensconced within that substrate. But I'm also perfectly aware that not every religious or poetic system gives rise to democratic institutions, first. And also that there are Christian substructures, maybe the most obviously in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church,
Right.
where the same metaphysical principles apply, but out of which a democracy did not emerge. And
Yeah, so what he's basically saying here is that rationality is not enough, and Christianity is also not enough, because the foundations of democracy are fundamentally irrational and not based on truth. They are, in fact, based on Judeo-Christian, a particular interpretation of Judeo-Christian values, and I would say you can get that interpretation out of a literary interpretation of a set of symbols, but you actually cannot get that interpretation from just looking at nature. That's what Rousseau tried to do, and Rousseau, let's just say he didn't look very hard at nature. He was too pampered from his city lifestyle. So I'm going to skip forward to another part in this video that I think is relevant, and then I'm going to call it out. Okay, so here we are a little later in the video. They went to talking about, from pure religion and astrology and whatnot, they went to talking about successful governance, and here I believe Douglas is going after Sam, because Sam said that the atheism of the Maoist and Stalinist and just more broadly communist states that grew out of Marx's belief systems were not basically that they weren't directly, or they weren't related to the atheism of Stalin and Mao. So right now they're talking about that, and we'll see what they have to say.
None of them thought that they were being observed and would be held accountable.
It doesn't help when you think God is on your side. We have just as many examples where people do it because they think God is on their side, right?
Sure.
God is watching and clapping.
I'm not denying that. I'm saying that the attempt to make this a tennis match over the 20th century is a mistake. We're still trying to work out what caused it. Religion had a role, atheism had a role. But the perpetual tennis match of it, I think.
well, and there is something to be said at a more sophisticated level, I would say, for the idea that you have an obligation to a transcendent ethic. Now, you make that claim in the moral landscape. You lay out a transcendent ethic, in my estimation, and that's one that puts the onus of responsibility on the individual to act in a way that at minimum minimizes suffering. And so, and you think of that as a statement of fact, that that's the proper way of being, and I think about it as an axiomatic statement of faith, and that's one of our differences. But
He's right. This is an axiomatic statement of faith. There's no fact that says I should not hurt people. There might be a fact that says if I hurt somebody, other people will hurt me, but that still implies that you'd rather not be hurt, which is not a fact, it's a feeling. Now, the fact that a lot of people share that feeling is a fact, but again, that's an appeal to consensus, not logic, and not rationality.
I have been very careful in my analysis of the relationship between the idea of sovereignty and the idea of religious belief. And one of the things that I have worked out, I think, partly from reading such people as Eliade and Jung, was that there is an emergent idea of sovereignty that does involve being accountable to a god. And here's how I would justify that, and I would think about this essentially from a practical and biological perspective, independent of any metaphysical reality that it might have. So the ancient Mesopotamians, for example, believed that their emperor was the incarnation or the representative of a god named Marduk, and that actually bestowed certain ethical responsibilities on the ruler. And so the ruler had to be a good Marduk in order to be a sovereign, to be regarded as sovereign. He had to be the embodiment of these divine principles. And it took the Mesopotamians a very, very long period of time perhaps several tens of thousands of years, they weren't Mesopotamian during that whole time, obviously, to work out what those principles of sovereignty should be. And the Mesopotamians encoded this in their fictions, in their religious fictions, making essentially the proposition that the proper ruler had to have eyes all the way around his head, because that was one of the attributes of Marduk. So he was someone who was genuinely paying attention, who was capable of coming into voluntary contact with the great chaotic substructure of being and cutting it into pieces and making the habitable world, and also speaking words that were truthful, that had the power, the magic power of truth. And the ruler had to act that out if he was going to be the sort of ruler that his people weren't entitled to slay and sacrifice. And then once a year at the New Year's festival, he would go outside the city, the walled city, and he would act out his role of Marduk. And the priest would humiliate him and ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, so that he could remember that he had a responsibility to undertake to embody this relationship with these divine principles. And the thing that's so important about this, that's so absolutely crucially important, is that it established the principle that even if you were at the top of a hierarchy, you weren't absolute. There was something above you that you were subordinate to. And one of the extraordinarily useful ideas about the abstraction of even God as a personified spirit, let's say, is that it allows every leader to be subordinate to something that's beyond him. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be misused, but it's a very, very, very important idea.
Yeah, except you can get there the other way around. You can realize that even if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you are radically dependent on everyone else. But the tip of the
but
pyramid...
everybody at the tip of a hierarchy doesn't believe that. Sometimes they believe that they can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, but I'm saying, if you're going to believe something that's compatible with rationality globally and has the least conceivable downside, I would put in that place not a superstitious attachment to a notion of an invisible friend or punisher who's above you. I would put in its place the totally defensible and palpably true fact that you could be the king of the world, and you are dependent on everyone around you to eat, to not be murdered by them. I mean, you are. I mean, it's amazing how precarious even a totalitarian regime is. I mean, the amazing thing is that these last at all, because in many cases it would just take 50 people to act in unison to kill the tyrant, right? But it never happens because you just have a first mover problem. Everyone is afraid to be the first person shot. But it is a genuine mystery that these systems even perpetuate themselves. And when they unravel, when you see Gaddafi being murdered in a crowd, you realize, wow, it really is just a matter of the restraint and fear of human beings keeping any of these things together. A benign, if you wanted a...
Okay, so remember what I said about atheism being a product of the French Revolution? Well, you can see that it's on full display right here. And okay, there's a couple things about this. Firstly, the idea that sovereignty is abstracted from the individual. And it's not the individual, and it's also not fear or tyranny or illogical restraint holding people back. Like, this is these two things are two sides of the same coin. So what he's actually describing here is the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn, although he doesn't know it because he hasn't studied symbolism at all, clearly. So Saturn is the Dark Father. It's Scar in the Lion King. It also is fear, rules, the law, responsibility, and restraint. Okay, so that's what he's saying is the only thing holding back the revolution, the French Revolution, really, is Saturn. Now, Saturn got turned in the Judeo-Christian context into the devil. It got turned into Satan. So what he's basically saying, whenever somebody says, like, fear, the law, restraint, rules, limitations, material, this is the only thing that's keeping the revolution from happening, they are a Marxist. So what he's basically saying is that fear is the only thing that keeps the revolution. It's not that, oh, there was some transcendent order that was keeping the revolution down. It's not that the law was good or that there was genuine sovereignty. It's that no, people are just afraid and they're scared. And if they weren't scared, then they'd stab 50 people would run up and stab the leader. This is a great recipe for anarchy. It's almost like he's describing the sneakiest social off switch that ever existed. It's like, you want to turn society off, you preach this message to a group of dumb people. So talk about stochastic terrorism. What he's talking about is essentially a Marxist revolution. It's sic semper tyrannis, and you have people doing that in the U.S. right now. So when he criticizes Jordan for saying, oh, well, the idea of an individual sovereignty is the only thing keeping the disembodied, personalized representation of sovereignty is the only thing keeping the system intact. And then he turns around and says, no, it's only human fear and the law that keeps, blind subservience to authority that keeps people from stabbing their dictator to death. It's like, what Jordan is talking about is the birth of democracy and the personal representation of it in a sort of narrative format. What Sam's talking about is a Marxist fucking revolution. So you remember what I said about atheism coming out of the French Revolution and how if you scratch an atheist, you'll find a French revolutionary. Well, here we go. There it is. I wouldn't be surprised if he starts talking about the opiate of the masses and, dispossession of labor and whatnot and capital. Here we go.
A hierarchy where you had a kind of benign philosopher king pulling the reins of a society. I'm not saying we do, but even there, you could have an ethical one. You could have one where, and a non-superstitious one, the one where someone recognized, hey, this is how we're doing it, but we are at the top of this hierarchy, am radically dependent on being surrounded by as many happy people as possible.
Well,
so the other thing too about what he's saying is that there's an interesting materialistic trick where all you have to do is reduce a thing to its parts and put just in front of it. So you say, well, that's not a mind, that's a collection of brain cells. That's not a fetus, that's a collection of cells. That's I don't know. That's not a handshake, that's just two hands grasping each other. It's like you can suck all the meaning out of something by reducing it one part down and putting the word just in front of it. It's like that's not a neural net. That's just neurons. That's just electrons in a computer. That's not a cardiovascular system. That's just blood in pipes. It's like but to do that misses the nature of reality. So if he's saying, well, that's not a sovereign king, that's a bunch of happy peasants. It's like, or a bunch of happy voters in a democracy, whatever, citizens, whatever. It's like he's describing the exact same thing. He's just saying that, oh, well, that's not a brain, that's just electrons in a soup of yogurt. It's like, who cares if it's electrons? It's a brain, dude.
Look, I mean, I don't. In some profound sense, I don't disagree with
we're
that.
Actually, this sounds like a fiction, but we're living with this problem, and we encounter this more and more when you talk, in Silicon Valley, as you and I occasionally do, and I'm sure you do as well, where you meet people who are fantastically wealthy, who seem uncannily detached detached at the fact that there's this growing chasm between them and those they know and the rest of humanity, and begins to wonder what level of wealth inequality will everyone find alarming. And
so did I tell you that if you scratch an atheist you'll find a French revolutionary?
Some people are acting as though there is no level that is alarming, that there's the kind of a law of nature that this thing can grow just impossibly, to the point where we have trillionaires walking around, and in driving in their motorcades, and it's kind of it's sort of the libertarian religion one occasionally runs into, and clearly there's some level of inequality that's untenable, or at least would be undesirable. I mean,
well, it's a funny thing.
Alright, I'm going to stop it right there because he basically proved my point. But my point is that atheism does not exist in a vacuum. It has its roots in the French Revolution. If you scratch an atheist, you will find a French revolutionary, or at least somebody concerned with the problems of that time. And they have an extremely difficult time representing values as personalities. Now, you can reduce a personalized value to a group of its constituents very easily. That's something you can do. You can make well, that's not a brain, that's just electrons in yogurt inside a bone. But know that when you're doing that, you're being incredibly dishonest, because you are describing the parts that make the emergent reality, but the emergent reality, by definition, is more than the sum of its parts. And when you fail to take that into account, you are a materialist. You're reducing everything to its parts, and you're failing to account that what comes out of a bunch of electrons in a soup of yogurt is more than a bunch of electrons in a yogurt soup. It's your brain, the thing that you're using to engage with reality through. And when you don't realize that, you have big problems dealing with religious people, and you drive yourself crazy talking to them, because you don't understand that what they're describing is an emergent reality. Now, what the nature of that emergent reality is an interesting question, but we have to get there first. So, until next time. I hope you found this engaging. Leave your answers in the comments, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.